September 25th, 1954, at 2:23 in the afternoon, inside a cramped radio station office on the third floor of the Kiska Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. A 19-year-old truck driver sat in a wooden chair with a cracked leather seat, his knees bouncing so violently that the loose change in his pocket, exactly 87 cents, everything he had left after paying for gas, rattled against his thigh like a nervous drum roll. His name was Elvis Aaron Presley. And in approximately 4 minutes, a man he had never met was going to tell him that he had absolutely no future in music. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about those hands. They were working-class hands, calloused from loading and unloading boxes at Crown Electric Company, roughened from hours spent gripping a steering wheel, delivering electrical supplies across Memphis for $1.25 an hour. But right now, those hands were shaking so badly that the young man had to press them flat against his thighs just to keep them still. His hair, jet black, slicked back with 3/4 of a jar of Royal Crown pomade, caught the afternoon light streaming through a dusty window. He'd spent 45 minutes in front of a cracked bathroom mirror that morning, getting it just right. Getting himself just right. Because today mattered. Today was supposed to be the day everything changed. See, just a few months earlier, something extraordinary had happened. A small record label called Sun Records had taken a chance on this nervous kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, and released a song called That's All Right. And against all odds, against every prediction, against the fundamental laws of what was supposed to happen to poor boys from public housing projects, that song had caught fire. Local radio stations played it. People called in demanding to hear it again. And suddenly, Elvis Presley wasn't just a truck driver with a dream anymore. He was a truck driver with an asterisk record. But here's what they don't tell you about that first taste of success. It doesn't eliminate fear. It amplifies it, because now you have something to lose. Now there are expectations. Now there are people watching, waiting to see if you're the real thing or just a fluke. And that's exactly what brought Elvis to this third-floor office on this particular September afternoon. A prominent Nashville music critic named Vernon Vic McAllister had agreed to meet with him. McAllister was legendary in Tennessee music circles, a former talent scout for RCA Victor, a man who had written for Billboard magazine, a gatekeeper who could open doors that stayed locked for everyone else. If McAllister believed in you, your career was made. If he didn't, well, Elvis shifted in his chair, wiped his palms on his pink and black shirt, and tried to remember how to breathe. The office door swung open. Vic McAllister walked in like a man who had somewhere more important to be. He was 53 years old, wearing a brown suit that probably cost more than Elvis made in a month, carrying a leather briefcase and a look of barely concealed impatience. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't smile. He simply sat down behind his desk, opened a folder and said, "So, you're the truck driver." For the next 6 minutes, Vic McAllister proceeded to dismantle every dream Elvis Presley had ever dared to hold. He had listened to That's All Right. He had done his research, and he had reached a conclusion that he delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon cutting away diseased tissue. "Son, I've been in this business for 27 years. I've seen hundreds of young men walk through doors like this one, all of them convinced they're going to be the next big thing. You know what most of them have in common?" Elvis shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. "They disappear, they go back to their regular jobs, their regular lives, and within 5 years nobody remembers their names." McAllister leaned forward. "You want to know why? Because they were different, and different doesn't sell. Different confuses people. Different makes radio programmers nervous and record executives cautious." He tapped the folder on his desk, Elvis's folder, containing press clippings, notes, observations. "I listened to your record, 3 times actually, because I couldn't figure out what I was hearing. It's not country, it's not rhythm and blues, it's not pop, it's nothing. It's a category that doesn't exist." The young man in the chair felt his face begin to burn, a heat that started at his collar and climbed upward, painting his cheeks red. "And then there's your asterisk performance," McAllister continued, pronouncing the word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "I've heard the reports, the way you move on stage, the gyrating," he shook his head. "Son, that's not entertainment, that's vulgarity. That's the kind of thing that gets records banned and venues shut down." Elvis opened his mouth to defend himself, but McAllister wasn't finished. "Let me give you some advice, and I want you to listen carefully because I'm doing you a favor here. You're too different to be commercially viable. The music industry doesn't reward originality, it rewards reliability. It rewards artists who fit into boxes, who give audiences exactly what they expect." He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. You don't fit into any box, Mr. Presley, and in this business that's not a compliment, it's a death sentence. Elvis stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. So what are you saying? He managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Vic McAllister looked at him with something that might have been pity, if pity could feel so much like contempt. I'm saying stick to truck driving, son. You're a nice kid, you've got a decent voice, but you're not what America wants, and frankly, he paused, gathering his briefcase, between you and me, you don't have what it takes. Some people are born to be stars, you were born to be a fan. The door closed behind him, and Elvis Presley stood alone in that empty office, his dreams crumbling into dust around his feet. The walk from the third floor to the parking lot took approximately 2 minutes. Elvis didn't remember a single step. He moved through the hallway like a sleepwalker, past the receptionist who didn't look up, down the stairs with their worn carpet and brass handrails, through the lobby where businessmen in suits conducted lives that seemed impossibly far from his own. Outside, the Memphis afternoon was warm and golden. September light filtered through oak trees. Cars passed on Union Avenue. Somewhere a radio played, maybe even his song, the song that had made him believe, stupidly, recklessly, that he might actually be somebody. He made it to his car. A 1942 Lincoln Continental that technically belonged to Crown Electric, a company vehicle he'd borrowed, stolen, really, because he didn't have anything better to drive to the most important meeting of his life. He sat down in the driver's seat. He closed the door. And then 19-year-old Elvis Aaron Presley, a boy who had grown up so poor that his family had lived in a 2-room house in Tupelo with no running water, a boy who had been bullied in school for carrying his guitar and wearing clothes that didn't fit, a boy who had believed with every fiber of his being that music was his ticket out, put his head against the steering wheel and began to cry. Not gentle tears. Not dignified cinematic weeping. This was the ugly kind of crying, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep that it feels like your chest is being torn open from the inside, the kind that racks your body with shudders and leaves you gasping for air between sobs. He cried for the father who had always looked at him with quiet disappointment, as if Elvis's dreams were just another reminder of Vernon Presley's own failures. He cried for the mother who had sacrificed everything, her health, her happiness, her chance at any other kind of life, because she believed her son was special, and what if she was wrong? What if he let her down? He cried for every bully who had called him names in the hallways of Hum's High School, every teacher who had written him off, every authority figure who had looked at him and seen nothing but a poor kid from the wrong side of town with delusions of grandeur. And he cried for himself, for the young man who had dared to hope, for the boy with the pomade-slicked hair and the pink shirt, and the 87 cents in his pocket who had walked into that office believing, truly believing, that today might be the day his life changed. It had changed, all right. Just not the way he'd imagined. Nearly 2 hours passed. The sun shifted across the parking lot, shadows lengthened. The September heat gave way to something cooler, something that felt like evening approaching. And still Elvis sat in that borrowed Lincoln, his face swollen, his eyes red, his throat raw from sounds he didn't even know he could make. Stick to truck driving. You don't fit into any box. You don't have what it takes. The words played on an endless loop in his mind, each repetition cutting a little deeper than the last. Because here's the thing about rejection that they never tell you, it doesn't just hurt your feelings. It doesn't just wound your pride. It reaches down into the very core of who you believe yourself to be and asks a question that has no easy answer. What if they're right? What if all those dreams, all that hope, all those hours spent practicing guitar until his fingers bled and singing until his voice cracked? What if it was all just a waste? A beautiful, pointless fantasy spun by a boy who should have known better than to want more than he deserved. Elvis Presley sat in that parking lot, drowning in that question. And he had no idea how to answer it. Then something shifted. It happened somewhere around the 2-hour mark, somewhere in the quiet space between the last sob and the first clear breath. It happened without warning, without fanfare, without any conscious decision. The energy changed. The sorrow didn't disappear. It was still there, still heavy in his chest, still stinging behind his eyes. But alongside it, underneath it, pushing up through it like a green shoot breaking through cracked concrete came something else. Anger. Not wild, uncontrolled rage, something quieter than that, something colder. A barely controlled fire that started in his gut and spread outward until his whole body felt different, alive in a way it hadn't been before, charged with something that felt suspiciously like purpose. Stick to truck driving. Who was Vic McAllister to tell him what he could and couldn't become? You're too different. Too different for what? For whom? For a 53-year-old man in a brown suit who probably hadn't taken a creative risk in his entire life. You don't have what it takes. Says who? Elvis gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and this time they weren't shaking. This time they were steady, strong. Because somewhere in that dark ocean of despair, he had touched bottom. And when you touch bottom, you have a choice. You can stay there or you can push off. He chose to push. That night, Elvis drove to his parents' house on Alabama Street. It was a small place, rented with money he contributed from his truck driving job, filled with second-hand furniture and the smell of his mother's cooking. Not much to look at by most standards, but it was home. It was the one place in the world where he could be exactly who he was without apology. Gladys Presley was waiting in the kitchen. She knew before he said a single word. Mothers always know. She saw it in the way he walked, in the set of his shoulders, in the redness around his eyes that no amount of cold water could hide. She didn't ask what happened. She simply pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, set down a cup of coffee, and waited. And eventually, haltingly, Elvis told her everything. The meeting, the rejection, the words that had cut so deep they'd left wounds he wasn't sure would ever heal. When he finished, Gladys was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took her son's face in her hands, those working-class hands that had held him as a baby, that had wiped away his tears as a child, that had applauded at every amateur talent show and church performance. And she looked him directly in the eyes. Listen to me, son, that man in that office. He didn't reject you, he rejected what he couldn't understand, and that's not the same thing. Elvis started to protest, but she shook her head. No, you listen, your whole life people have told you that you're different, too quiet, too sensitive, too strange, dressing wrong, walking wrong, singing wrong. And every single time they said it like it was a bad thing, like being different was something to be ashamed of. Her eyes, bright and fierce, held his gaze. But here's what I know, Elvis, here's what I've always known. The things that make you different, those are the exact things that are going to make you great. That man in that suit, he couldn't see it because he's too small. His vision is too limited. He can only see what already exists. He can't imagine what might be. She squeezed his hands. Strong people turn pain into power. That's what we do. That's what the Presleys have always done. We take the hurt and we transform it into something beautiful, something nobody can take away from us. Elvis felt something shift in his chest. Not a healing, the wound was still too fresh for that, but something else. A realigning. A recalibration of everything he thought he understood about himself and his place in the world. So what do I do? He asked. Gladys smiled. You do exactly what you've been doing. You walk into every room, every stage, every recording session, and you be so completely, unapologetically yourself that they have no choice but to pay attention. And when they tell you no, because they will, Elvis, they will tell you no 100 more times. You let it fuel you. You let it make you better. You prove them wrong not by arguing, but by achieving. She stood up and kissed his forehead. That man said you don't fit into any box. Good, boxes are for small things. You were never meant to be small. The next 2 years were a masterclass in transformation. Elvis Presley took every rejection, every criticism, every dismissive comment from every small-minded gatekeeper, and he used them as rocket fuel. He didn't change who he was, he doubled down on it. The music that didn't fit into any category, he made that his signature. He created a sound that borrowed from gospel, country, rhythm, and blues, and something entirely his own, a fusion so unprecedented that it would eventually be given a name: rock and roll. The stage presence that critics called vulgar, he amplified it. He moved in ways that had never been seen on American stages before, channeling something raw and electric and undeniable. When he performed, audiences didn't just watch, they screamed. They reached. They lost themselves in something they couldn't quite name but knew instinctively that they needed. He played local venues, then regional tour, then national television. On January 28, 1956, Elvis Presley appeared on Stage Show, broadcast to millions of living rooms across America. He was 21 years old, wearing a velvet shirt and a look of barely contained fire, and when he opened his mouth to sing, shake, rattle, and roll, the country held its breath. This was not what anyone expected. This was not country, this was not pop. This was something new, something dangerous, something that felt like the future arriving ahead of schedule. And America, against all predictions, against every expert's assessment, fell completely, hopelessly in love. July 2, 1956. RCA Victor's recording studio in New York City. Elvis Presley stood at the center of the room, headphones around his neck, preparing to record what would become one of the most iconic songs in music history. Hound Dog. The session was electric. The band locked into a groove that felt like controlled chaos. And Elvis, no longer the nervous truck driver from Memphis, but not yet the legend he would become, operated at the outer edge of his ability without visible effort. Every move, every vocal inflection, every split-second decision felt both spontaneous and inevitable. It was quite simply perfection. And watching from the corner of the studio, having begged for an invitation through mutual contacts, stood Vic McAllister. The same man who had sat in that Kiska Hotel office 2 years earlier and told Elvis to stick to truck driving. The same man who had called him too different and not commercially viable. The same man who had predicted, with all the confidence of a self-proclaimed expert, that Elvis Presley would disappear into obscurity like so many other dreamers before him. He watched the entire session without saying a word. And when it was over, when the final take was captured and the musicians began packing up, McAllister did something he had never done in 29 years of working in the music industry. He apologized. He crossed the studio floor to where Elvis was standing, and he extended his hand, and he said words that cost him more than any amount of money ever could. I was wrong about you, son, dead wrong, and I need you to know, it wasn't because you weren't talented. It was because I was too limited to understand what you were doing. I could only see what already existed. And you? He shook his head, something like wonder in his eyes. You were already living in a future that hadn't happened yet. Elvis looked at the older man for a long moment. All those hours crying in the parking lot, all those nights replaying the rejection in his mind, all that pain, that doubt, that burning shame of being told he wasn't enough. It was still there somewhere. Wounds like that never fully heal. But looking at Vic McAllister now, this small man in his expensive suit, this gatekeeper who had once held the power to make or break dreams, Elvis realized something profound. The rejection had never been about him. It had been about the limitations of the person delivering it. I appreciate that, Mr. McAllister, Elvis said quietly. But I need you to understand something too. That day in your office, when you told me I wasn't good enough, that didn't break me, it built me. Every word you said became fuel for this fire. So in a way, he paused, and for just a moment that famous half-smile flickered across his face. In a way, I should probably thank you. He didn't wait for a response. He walked out of that studio into a July afternoon, into a world that was already beginning to rearrange itself around his existence, into a future so impossibly vast that even he couldn't fully comprehend it. And Vic McAllister was left standing alone, holding nothing but his regret. The untold legacy of Elvis Presley is not simply a story about music. It's not about record sales, though he would eventually sell over 1 billion albums worldwide, more than any other solo artist in history. It's not about fame, though his face would become one of the most recognized images on the planet. It's not even about cultural impact, though he would fundamentally reshape American entertainment, breaking down barriers between musical genres and proving that authenticity could triumph over conformity. The untold legacy is about what happens in parking lots. It's about the moments between rejection and resurrection. It's about the thousands of people throughout history and the thousands watching this video right now who have been told by some authority figure, some expert, some person in a position of power that they don't have what it takes, that they should give up, that they should stick to something safer, something smaller, something that fits into pre-existing boxes. The untold legacy of Elvis Presley is proof, undeniable, spectacular proof, that those people are often wrong. Legends don't start as legends. They start as hopeful young people with a dream. They start as truck drivers with 87 cents in their pockets, sitting in borrowed cars, crying because someone in a brown suit decided they weren't worth believing in. And what separates the legends from everyone else isn't talent, not really. It's not even luck. It's what they do with the rejection. Do they let it define them? Do they accept the verdict of limited experts as gospel truth? Do they shrink themselves down to fit into boxes they were never meant to occupy? Or do they take that pain, that burning, gut-wrenching, soul-crushing pain, and transform it into something powerful? Strong people turn pain into power. That's not just a nice saying. That's a blueprint for an extraordinary life. Because here's the truth that Vic McAllister didn't understand, and that too many gatekeepers still don't understand today. Rejection isn't failure. Rejection is just someone else's inability to see what you see in yourself. It's a statement about their limitations, not yours. And the moment you understand that, the moment you truly, deeply internalize that truth, you become unstoppable. Not because you stop getting rejected, but because rejection stops having the power to stop you. Elvis Presley was rejected, mocked, dismissed, and written off more times than anyone could count. Critics called his music noise. Religious leaders called his performances sinful. Industry experts called him unmarketable. And he made them eat every single word. Not through argument, through achievement. He became so undeniably, spectacularly successful that history had no choice but to revise its opinion of him. The critics who had dismissed him spent the rest of their careers explaining why they had been wrong. The experts who had predicted his failure became footnotes in his legend. That's the power of transforming pain into purpose. That's the untold legacy. So as this video ends, I want to leave you with a question. And I want you to really sit with it. Have you ever been told you weren't good enough? Have you ever had your dreams dismissed by someone who was supposed to know better? Have you ever sat in your own version of that parking lot, crying over words that cut deeper than you knew words could cut? And if so, what did you do to prove them wrong? Drop your story in the comments below, because every single person watching this video has that story. Every single person has faced their own Vic McAllister, their own moment of devastating rejection. And the ones who are still here, still watching, still dreaming. You're the ones who chose to push off the bottom. You're the ones who transformed pain into power. You're the future legends. And I, for one, can't wait to see what you become.